There are moments in life when silence is more terrifying than screaming. The machines in Amina Sadebe's hospital room did not sound like comfort. They sounded like time running out. Each beep from the heart monitor cut through the cold air with the same cruel rhythm, like a clock refusing to stop for mercy. The oxygen line whispered beside her bed. The fluorescent lights above her glowed too white, too clean, too indifferent. Nurses came and went in soft shoes, speaking in lowered voices, adjusting drips, checking numbers, writing notes. And in the center of all that sterile stillness, Amina lay motionless beneath a white blanket, while the world slowly began preparing itself to let her go. But Amina was not gone. She could hear everything. She heard the monitor. She heard the footsteps. She heard the doors opening and closing. And then she heard the one voice that turned her fear into something colder than panic. Her husband had entered the room. Daniel Casa stopped near the end of the bed, and to anyone watching, he looked exactly like the man grief had broken. His suit was dark, expensive, tasteful. His jaw was tight in all the right places. His shoulders carried the burdened stillness of a husband trying not to collapse. Even his breathing sounded rehearsed into sorrow. That was the frightening part, because Amina could hear something the rest of the hospital could not. He was not heartbroken. He was calculating. He moved closer, slow enough to seem tender, gentle enough to appear devoted. If a nurse had looked in at that moment, she would have seen a man standing beside the unconscious woman he loved, silently willing her to come back. But Amina knew the truth. And the truth was standing over her bedside in polished shoes. Daniel leaned slightly toward her face. His voice dropped so low it barely disturbed the air. You should have stayed away from things you didn't understand. Inside her trapped mind, Amina exploded into terror. She tried to move, tried to lift a finger, tried to force her eyes open, tried to drag one single word out of her body and into the room. Nothing happened. Then she heard a small sound, a soft click, the slight movement of plastic, the brush of fingers too close to equipment that should have been left untouched. And in the prison of her own body, Amina screamed. No, no, no. But no sound came out. Then footsteps approached from the hallway. Daniel stepped back instantly. By the time a nurse entered with medication, his face had already changed. His hand rested gently near Amina's. His expression had become the perfect portrait of helpless devotion. Has there been any change? He asked softly. The nurse shook her head. Not yet. He lowered his eyes and nodded like a man trying to stay strong for everyone else. And that was the moment Amina understood something with absolute clarity. Daniel was not praying for her recovery. He was waiting for everyone else to stop expecting it. And what terrified her even more was the feeling that this had started long before the hospital. Because accidents do not always begin on the road. Sometimes they begin with a smile. Sometimes they begin with patience. And sometimes they begin the day you trust the wrong person with the map to your life. 9 days earlier, Amina Sadebe had been standing in front of a floor-to-ceiling glass window on the top floor of one of her development offices, looking over a city she had spent years helping rebuild without ever insisting that people know her name. At 36, Amina was one of the most powerful women in the country, and one of the least publicly understood. She was not loud. She was not flashy. She was not one of those people who posted luxury to prove relevance. She did not chase magazine covers, vanity interviews, or public adoration. Her wealth moved quietly. Her influence moved even quieter. Hospitals, logistics routes, medical supply contracts, housing developments, private trusts, school funding programs, emergency response networks. Amina's fingerprints were everywhere, even when her name was not. People who met her often underestimated her. They thought she was elegant, reserved, strategic. Some even mistook her restraint for softness. What they failed to understand was that Amina had built an empire not by speaking the loudest in the room, but by seeing the room clearly before everyone else did. She noticed patterns. She noticed motives. She noticed what people wanted from her. And because of that, she lived carefully. Until Daniel. She met him at a fundraising dinner nearly 2 years earlier, during one of those glittering charity evenings where everyone wore generosity like jewelry. There were speeches about community. There were auction paddles. There was expensive laughter drifting beneath chandeliers. And there was Daniel. He did not approach her like a man dazzled by status. He did not flatter too hard. He did not perform hunger. He did something much smarter. He paid attention. He listened. He remembered details. He asked questions that made it feel as though he had seen the woman instead of the machinery around her. For Amina, that was rare. For Daniel, that was strategy. At first, he seemed refreshingly different from the men who either feared her power or tried too quickly to benefit from it. He knew how to appear secure without being aggressive. He knew how to sound thoughtful without becoming intrusive. He knew when to pull closer and when to give space. And because even the strongest people can become vulnerable in the presence of what feels like peace, Amina allowed herself to believe she had found something genuine. She did not tell him everything. That was deliberate. She minimized the scale of some holdings. She simplified structures. She spoke generally about trusts and obligations without offering full visibility. Not because she wanted to deceive him, but because she had spent too many years learning that love reveals itself more clearly when money is slightly out of focus. Daniel never seemed bothered. He never pushed. He never complained. He adapted beautifully to whatever version of her life she allowed him to see. Which should have warned her. Because some people do not get close to you in order to love you. They get close enough to study the locks. After the wedding, nothing changed fast enough to trigger alarm. That was the brilliance of it. Daniel remained attentive, affectionate, composed. But little things began appearing in his conversations. Small questions, casual questions, forgettable questions. The kind of questions that seem harmless until you notice they all point in the same direction. What happens if one spouse is temporarily unable to sign documents? Who reviews medical authority in an emergency? Could family trustees intervene if someone is incapacitated? Who controls transitional approvals if a business owner disappears from public life? He asked these things lightly, curiously, almost playfully. And because the questions arrived in scattered moments, Amina tried not to overreact. Then another name entered the picture. Celeste Mbeki. Celeste did not walk into rooms. She glided into them like she had been born on the invitation list. Beautiful, poised, socially exact. She came from the kind of circles where influence was inherited before it was ever earned. She knew the old families. She knew the private event hosts. She knew how to say very little and still leave people talking about her after she was gone. Daniel met her at a private cultural gala. Amina had seen them speaking from across the room while she was tied up in conversation with 2 investors discussing a hospital expansion project. From a distance, nothing looked suspicious. Daniel smiled. Celeste smiled. People networked. Glasses clinked. Music floated through the hall. Nothing looked wrong. That is how carefully planned betrayal survives its early stages. It never looks wrong when the curtain is still up. But after that night, changes began. Daniel started turning his phone away more often. He became interested in invitations that never used to matter. He knew names Amina had never told him. He was suddenly familiar with people who belonged to circles she had intentionally kept separate from her marriage. And once, just once, Amina caught him standing inside her office longer than necessary, his eyes resting on the safe behind a panel wall he had never asked about before. He smiled when she appeared, but there was something in that smile that did not feel like marriage. It felt like measurement. Still, she said nothing. Not yet. Because caution has a flaw. Sometimes it keeps you safe, and sometimes it delays your response until danger has already moved into position. The crash happened on a rain-heavy evening that turned the roads into mirrors. Amina had stayed late after a strategy session regarding medical procurement delays at one of her facilities. Her driver, Joel, a careful and quiet man who had been with her team for years, decided to take the eastern bypass to avoid a traffic jam near the city center. They never made it all the way across. Halfway along the elevated stretch, a dark SUV appeared too fast from the side lane and struck them hard enough to send their car into a violent spin. Glass burst inward, metal twisted, headlights smeared into white chaos. Joel fought the wheel. Tires screamed. Then everything folded into impact. When emergency teams arrived, Joel was injured but conscious. Amina was not. The news spread with frightening speed. Prominent businesswoman in critical condition. Possible neurological trauma. Condition unstable. Family asks for privacy. Daniel arrived at the hospital looking like grief had dressed him personally. He spoke softly to doctors. He thanked nurses. He answered concerned calls with just the right amount of exhaustion. He stood beside Amina's bed like a man refusing to abandon hope. People admired him. People pitied him. People trusted what they were seeing. But what the hospital saw was not what Amina heard. Because somewhere inside the stillness of her body, awareness remained alive. She heard him cancel a specialist consultation one of her directors had arranged. She heard him ask discreet questions about temporary authority. She heard him say on the phone, one evening, in a voice too calm for a husband standing beside his unconscious wife, "Once they stop expecting improvement, the process becomes much simpler." The process. Not recovery. Not healing. The process. Then came the night that ended all doubt. A fragrance reached the room first, then heels. Then a woman's voice wrapped in careless certainty. "She cannot hear us," Celeste said. Daniel answered immediately. "Keep your voice down anyway." Amina felt her thoughts turn to ice. Celeste moved closer to the bed. "You said there were protections." "There are." "And if she wakes up?" A pause. Amina would remember that pause for the rest of her life. Daniel's answer came low and controlled. "She does not need to wake quickly. She only needs to remain out of the way long enough." Out of the way. As though she were an inconvenience. As though the woman whose life he had entered, whose trust he had earned, whose home he had shared, had become no more than timing. That was the moment something changed inside Amina. Not hope, not fear. Resolve. Before that night, she had wanted to wake up. After that night, she wanted to survive. And survival, when attached to truth, can become a very dangerous thing. The first person who understood she was still in there was not Daniel, not the lead neurologist, not administration. It was Nurse Leela. Leela had worked too many night shifts in intensive care to mistake desperate intention for random movement. On the fourth evening after the crash, while smoothing Amina's blanket and checking the edge of her monitor leads, she leaned close and whispered, "If you can hear me, try." Nothing happened. Leela waited. Then Amina's index finger trembled. It was so slight most people would have dismissed it. An involuntary flutter, a muscular ghost, a meaningless response. But Leela did not dismiss it. She checked again the next hour, and again before shift change. Same effort, same tiny signal. So instead of alerting everyone and risking attention from the wrong people, she contacted someone she trusted more than procedure. Dr. Samir Okan. Samir had once overseen critical care protocols at a facility quietly funded by one of Amina's private trusts. Years earlier, her late father had described him as one of the few men in medicine who valued integrity more than status. He arrived the next morning under the pretext of a specialist consultation and ran his own careful assessments. Eye movement, response lag, stimulation patterns, cognitive awareness indicators. By the time sunset touched the windows, Samir knew two things. First, Amina was conscious inside her body. Second, if Daniel discovered that too soon, her recovery might not remain safe. So they did not announce a miracle. They built a secret around one. Under carefully controlled medical justification, Amina was transferred to a neurological recovery unit, connected to a private specialist center. Daniel signed the paperwork too quickly. He thought she was being moved further away from meaningful recovery and into slow observation. He did not realize he had just helped deliver her into protection. Recovery did not come beautifully. It came brutally. Speech did not return in a cinematic burst. Movement did not flood back overnight. Strength did not reappear just because she wanted it badly enough. Every inch of progress felt humiliatingly small. One blink meant yes. 2 blinks meant no. A slight pressure in one finger meant try again. A glance to the left meant pain. A glance to the right meant unclear. For days, language existed only in fragments. Then, with the aid of a communication tablet and more effort than tears could measure, Amina managed to form her first complete sentence. It took 11 minutes. Samir read the screen. "Do not tell my husband I am awake." After that, the room changed. This was no longer only a medical recovery. It was the beginning of a controlled counterstrike. Amina's chief legal counsel was contacted under strict confidentiality. Then came a forensic accountant. Then a cybersecurity specialist. Then an investigator whose reputation depended on being invisible. No one moved loudly. No one rushed. Every call was deliberate. Every report was contained. Every action was timed. Amina still could not stand for long. Her voice was still rough and weak. Sometimes fatigue hit so hard she shook afterward. But from a recovery bed, with half her body still trying to remember how to serve her, she began dismantling the illusion Daniel had built around himself. The evidence came in layers. Deleted messages restored from backups Daniel assumed were erased. Private transfers routed through holding accounts linked to acquaintances in Celeste's social orbit. Draft requests prepared in advance to seek influence over temporary financial access if Amina's condition remained uncertain. Audio fragments. calendar overlaps, meeting logs. Then the messages became uglier. One note from Celeste read, "Once the funeral is behind us, stop pretending humility and start acting like the future already belongs to you." Another message from Daniel made even the investigator pause before reading it aloud. People trust the image before they question the man wearing it. Amina stared at that line for a long time. Because that was Daniel in one sentence. A man who had never loved what was real, only what could be worn. Then Joel recovered enough to speak. His injuries were serious, but he remembered more than anyone expected. In the week before the crash, he had noticed the same dark SUV twice on routes Amina did not publicly use. At the time, he assumed it was a coincidence. He never mentioned it because the vehicle never acted openly aggressive. Now, with everything else surfacing, coincidence began to feel expensive. Was it enough to prove Daniel arranged the crash? No, not yet. But it was enough to make one thing undeniable. Daniel had seen the accident as opportunity, and that was more than enough for Amina. Her lawyers gave her options. She could shut him out quietly. She could dissolve the marriage through sealed proceedings. She could freeze his access, cut the network around him, and let him disappear from her life without public drama. But Amina refused. Quiet endings are merciful. Daniel had earned witness. Because men like him survive secrecy. They relocate. They retell. They reshape their image and audition for sympathy somewhere new. No. Daniel had built himself out of appearances, and appearance was the very place he needed to fall. Then came the final insult. Through a chain of private alerts and invitation chatter, Amina's team discovered that Daniel and Celeste were planning a wedding. Soon. Not eventually. Not after public closure. Soon enough to replace one woman's uncertain future with another woman's polished entrance. Elegant venue. Selective guest list. Controlled visibility. Just enough publicity to legitimize the union. Just enough privacy to avoid uncomfortable questions. Amina read the details in silence while the tablet trembled slightly in her hands. He was not merely moving on. He was stepping over her while the world still believed she might never rise again. He was preparing to bury her socially before she had even fully returned to herself. And somehow, instead of breaking her, that knowledge brought a terrible calm. "Good," she whispered. Samir looked at her. "Good?" Amina lifted her eyes. Let him believe the stage is his. From that moment, recovery had a second heartbeat. Every exercise mattered more. Every painful step carried purpose. Layla helped her relearn balance in measured walks across the room. Samir monitored her strength and warned her repeatedly that trauma recovery should not be confused with readiness. Speech therapy sessions became battle preparation. Breathing control became performance control. Even clothing became symbolic. She did not want to arrive looking fragile. She wanted to arrive undeniable. At the same time, the legal team prepared in silence. Asset restrictions were scheduled. Account reviews were timed. Protective filings were sealed. Notification triggers were arranged to activate within minutes of a specific signal. Two highly respected journalists, chosen not for sensationalism but credibility, were quietly placed on standby should public verification become necessary. Nothing would be random. If Daniel fell, he would fall in full daylight. The night before the wedding, Layla stood behind Amina and adjusted the shoulders of the ivory suit she had selected for the next day. It was sharp, elegant, minimal. Not soft enough to ask for sympathy. not sentimental enough to suggest weakness. This was not a woman dressing for survival. This was a woman dressing for truth. Layla met Amina's eyes in the mirror. "Are you certain you should do this in person?" Amina held her own reflection. The woman staring back at her was leaner than before, harder. The softness of trust had left her face, but something stronger had taken its place. "No," she said quietly. "But certainty is not what I need. I only need to stand long enough for them to see me." That morning, the chapel looked like innocence had been professionally arranged. White flowers lined the aisle. Music floated gently under stained glass light. Guests arrived in expensive fabrics and polished expressions. Men exchanged quiet handshakes. Women lowered their voices just enough to turn curiosity into elegance. Programs rustled. Perfume mixed with roses. The room was built for vows, photographs, and illusion. Daniel stood near the altar in a cream suit fitted so perfectly it looked like success had been stitched around him. He carried himself like a man stepping into the life he believed he had earned. Celeste arrived moments later, draped in silk and confidence. She wore triumph lightly, as though she expected admiration without ever having to request it. Even her smile carried anticipation. She looked like a woman arriving at the final scene of a story already won. And perhaps, in her mind, it was. The officiant began. Words about commitment. Words about trust. Words about sacred union, spoken over two people who understood loyalty only as appearance. Daniel's phone vibrated once, then again. Then again. He ignored it. Why would he not? Men on the verge of public victory rarely imagine that disaster is already climbing the steps behind them. He did not know his financial access had just tightened. He did not know emergency legal notices had triggered. He did not know certain internal reviews had already begun. He did not know the future he thought he was marrying into had already started collapsing. Then the officiant reached the ancient line. "If anyone objects to this union," he said, "speak now or forever hold your peace." The chapel doors opened. Silence did not fall. It shattered. Every face turned. Every breath stopped. Amina Sadebe stood in the doorway, alive. Alive. Not in memory, not in rumor, not in a framed portrait at a memorial. Alive, upright, dressed in ivory, with her chin lifted and her eyes fixed on the altar where betrayal had come to celebrate itself. At her side stood Nurse Layla in dark formal wear, composed and steady. On her other side was Hannah, little Hannah, her late sister's daughter, the child Amina had been raising with quiet devotion, the child Daniel had once described in a recovered message as an emotional complication attached to inheritance optics. Now that same child held Amina's hand tightly. Behind them came Samir, legal counsel and court officers. For one suspended second, the room forgot what to do with reality. Someone gasped. A program slipped from trembling fingers. The quartet fell silent mid-note. Celeste's face drained of color. Daniel did not merely look shocked. He looked hunted. Amina began walking. Slowly, deliberately. Every step down that aisle felt larger than sound. She did not rush. She did not glare wildly. She did not make the mistake of letting emotion outrun control. Because power does not need to sprint toward the room that finally belongs to truth. When she reached the center aisle, she stopped and turned her gaze briefly toward the officiant. "Please," she said calmly, her voice still touched by recovery, but firm enough to carry. "Continue. I would hate for a ceremony built on deception to lose momentum on my account." No one laughed. That made it devastating. Daniel stepped forward. "Amina, no." One word. Soft. Final. The entire room felt it. He stopped speaking. Amina turned slightly so the guests could see her face clearly. She let them absorb the impossible. The woman they believed might never wake had not only survived, she had arrived at the exact moment their assumptions became public shame. "You told people I might never recover," she said. "You presented yourself as a grieving husband while asking private questions about authority, access, and timing. You stood beside my hospital bed while I fought to come back, and you behaved as though my absence was already convenient." A wave of whispers moved through the chapel. Celeste found her voice first. "That is outrageous!" Amina looked at her. It was not a look of rage. It was worse. It was the look of someone who has gathered evidence and no longer needs permission to speak. "Would you like me to mention the date of your first hospital visit?" Amina asked. "Or perhaps the conversation in which my future was discussed as an obstacle rather than a life?" Celeste's mouth parted, but no answer came. Daniel tried to recover control. "You were unconscious. You don't understand what you think you heard." Amina's expression did not shift. "I understand enough." One of the court officers stepped forward. "Mr. Casa, please remain where you are." The voice sliced through the room. Daniel turned. "What is this?" Amina's legal counsel opened a file and spoke with the polished precision of someone who does not need theatrics because facts are heavy enough. "Improper efforts to influence restricted medical matters. Attempts to position for unauthorized financial advantage during a period of incapacitation. Coordinated communications suggesting material deception. Grounds for immediate legal review and protective intervention." Each phrase landed like a door closing. Daniel's face changed. Not into innocence, into realization. He understood exactly how much of the mask had just fallen away. Celeste took a step back from him. That small movement told the room everything. Because the woman who had been ready to marry him under stained glass and flowers was now already measuring distance between herself and the damage. Then Amina did something no one expected. She looked down at Hannah. The child's hand tightened in hers. For a brief moment, Amina squeezed back, and in that tiny exchange was the deepest truth of the entire room. Love had survived where deceit had not. Hannah took one careful step forward. Her eyes were wet, but her voice, though trembling, carried. "I prayed for Auntie Amina every night," she said. "You told me she might not hear me. But one day, when you thought I had gone, I heard you say I would be sent away after the papers were finished." The chapel recoiled. No speech from Amina could have cut deeper than that. Not because children are dramatic, but because children are believed when evil forgets they are listening. Daniel's composure cracked. "Hannah, that isn't what I meant." But the child stepped backward toward Amina, and that movement said more than any accusation ever could. "You are not safe. You are not trusted. You are seen now."
Phones started lifting quietly from seats. Some guests looked stunned. Others looked ashamed to be present. A few looked furious that they had been invited into a performance so rotten it had collapsed in public. The officiant lowered his book and said nothing. He looked like a man who had just watched ceremony itself refuse to protect lies.
Court papers were placed into Daniel's hands. Another set into Celeste's. No one moved to congratulate anyone anymore. No one cared about flowers. No one cared about music. The room had become a courtroom without walls. Daniel looked at Amina as if still hoping there was some private version of this conversation he could recover. "Amina," he said again. And now the name sounded different. Not loving. Not sorry. Desperate. "Please, let's talk about this privately." Privately. After hospital rooms. After whispered plans. After funeral language. After replacement vows. After a child's future had been spoken about like an administrative inconvenience. Amina studied him for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she said the line that would follow him longer than any legal paper. "You mistook my silence for weakness," she said. "What it really meant was that I was listening." Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came out. Because there is a point in every lie where language stops helping. This was his. Amina turned away from the altar, away from Celeste's silk, away from the flowers, away from the future they had built over greed and impatience. Hannah remained in her hand. Layla walked beside her. Samir stayed close enough to catch her if her strength gave way, but he never touched her. He knew this moment mattered too much. She had to leave under her own power. At the chapel doors, Amina paused. She did not look back immediately. When she finally did, her gaze passed over the room once, not searching, not pleading, simply sealing the memory of what it had become. Then she spoke. "You were ready to bury me while I was still fighting to breathe. But the truth has a way of arriving before the vows do." And with that, she walked out. Behind her, the room erupted. Questions, shock, phone calls, denials, whispers turning into headlines before people had even reached the parking lot. But Amina did not turn around. Outside, the air felt different. No antiseptic, no machinery, no staged sympathy. Just light, real light. The kind that falls on people after they survive something they were never supposed to survive. Hannah looked up at her, still holding her hand with the kind of trust only a child can give after fear. "Are we safe now?" she whispered. Amina bent carefully and touched the child's cheek. There was pain in her body. There was exhaustion in her bones. There was still a long road ahead. Hearings, recovery, rebuilding, explanations, decisions. But there was one truth she could finally give without hesitation. "Yes," she said. "Now we are." They stood there for a moment in the open air while the chapel behind them continued collapsing under the weight of its own deception. And for the first time since the crash, Amina did not feel trapped inside silence. She felt present. She felt real. She felt returned to herself. In the weeks that followed, the story spread, but not in the way Daniel would have feared most. It was not scandal alone that consumed him. It was exposure. Friends who once admired his restraint began revisiting old conversations with new understanding. Associates reviewed every charm-filled introduction through a different lens. Invitations stopped. Calls slowed. Doors that had opened for him because he looked respectable began closing because respectability had been revealed as costume. Celeste tried to distance herself. That failed. Too many messages existed. Too many witnesses had heard enough. Too many people had watched her stand dressed in white while another woman, still healing, walked in alive with the truth behind her. Amina, meanwhile, did something Daniel never expected. She did not spend her energy chasing public revenge. She spent it rebuilding quietly. She returned first to Hannah, to therapy, to rest, to physical recovery. Then she returned to work. Not all at once, not dramatically. A meeting here, a review there. A private visit to one of the hospitals she had funded. A conversation with staff who had feared she might be gone forever. Everywhere she went, people looked at her with that strange mixture of relief and reverence reserved for those who have walked near disappearance and returned carrying clarity. And clarity had changed her. Before the crash, Amina had been careful because she understood power. After the crash, she became something else. She understood timing. She understood witness. She understood that some forms of evil survive only because good people prefer clean endings. She no longer preferred them. Months later, when one of her legal advisors asked if she regretted making the chapel the place where everything ended, Amina gave a quiet answer. "No," she said. "He wanted a stage. I simply made sure the truth arrived before the applause." And perhaps that was the deepest lesson of all. Not every victory comes from shouting. Not every ending requires revenge in the form people expect. Sometimes, the loudest justice is simply appearing alive in the place where others had already decided to replace you. Sometimes, the strongest woman in the room is not the one everyone notices first. Sometimes, she is the one they mistook for finished. Sometimes, she is the one who heard everything. Sometimes, she is the one who waited. And sometimes, when the moment is right, she stands. Not to beg, not to explain, not even to punish, but to let truth do what truth has always done when given enough light. Expose. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more powerful stories of betrayal, survival, and unforgettable comebacks. And tell me in the comments, at what exact moment do you think Daniel realized it was over?